Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to yet another political video here on the Titan the Ted channel, hosted by me, your gracious host, the eponymous Titan Ted. Now, this is the second part in a three-part mini-series of videos I'm wanting to do on the etiquette of debating, whether it be on political videos or political topics or issues and topics of another nature, be it to do with, say, ethics, philosophy, sociology, finance, or anything other that may have contentious points to be sort of mulled over by different parties. Now, the last episode I did was on the importance of backing up your points with evidence and validating your arguments with well-supported evidence that is not just clearly showing your point of view, but also is well-founded and well-sourced. Because let's face it, not just the way that the evidence support your argument is important, but also the way it is sourced. It has to be preferably from a reputable source. Now, the second point I want to discuss in this mini-series is not just the importance of validating your points with evidence, but validating them by responding to criticism in a positive and constructive way. Because, I mean, I felt like when I was first studying politics that if someone criticised my point of view, that it felt like it was an attack on those points of views that I had. And this isn't necessarily the case. In many cases, people may just be criticising your argument, your side of the debate, your ideology, or your points of views, because they may just simply disagree with them, and they might just want to have a hearty argument and friendly debate about them. Now, granted, this isn't the case with everyone. There are some people out there who realistically are probably more into just criticising your side of the argument because it is opposing to their side of the argument. However, I do think once you've substantiated your side of the debate, be it on really any kind of debate with good evidence that's well sourced, you must respond to any given criticisms that may come your way, because let's face it, contentious issues always have two sides, and there will always be people on either side who want to criticise the other side of the argument. To properly validate and defend your side of the debate by not immediately dismissing criticism and properly responding to it in a mature and accurate way. Now, bringing up substantiated and well-founded evidence, as I listed out in my previous video on this topic of debating etiquette, is important to doing this, as it will help you to respond to possible criticisms in a constructive, careful, and accurate manner. When, say, for example, someone asks, let's say someone who disagrees with the idea of the gender pay gap and has evidence that shows it doesn't exist, or at least doesn't exist in the same way that those who do argue that it does exist, when they are told that their side of the argument is invalid, or that the point that they are arguing, that the gender pay gap doesn't exist, is invalid, then what I would expect that person to do, if they're willing to uphold their argument in a concise, strong, and mature enough way, is to say, no, I believe that the gender pay gap isn't real. Here's some financial evidence why, here's some sociological evidence why, and here's some statistics proving my point as to why I don't believe the gender pay gap exists, rather than just saying, well, no, your point of the argument is wrong. Because what that does is it just makes the evidence that is there for you to use, if there is some for your side of the argument, invalid and kind of pointless. And it's also, I feel, a little bit dismissive of the other side of the argument. I mean, even if the other side of the argument perhaps aren't necessarily the most logical in whether it be their views or the way they purvey their views to you and a broader audience, it still makes sense, I would say, in a general way, to respond to your criticism by saying, no, here's what I believe, here's why I disagree with your refutal of my beliefs, here's some evidence of me supporting my beliefs, and here's why I think that evidence supports that belief that I hold. This is, of course, the system of PEE: point, evidence, explanation. I've seen other YouTubers like Miss Misa talk about this, and it's a very valid way of arguing, and it's very basic and simple, but it is true, and it is very, very good way of arguing. You have a point, you support it with evidence, and then you explain it. That's the way I would say is probably the best way of responding to most criticisms. And while you're doing that, you should try to perhaps not get so worked up if it is something that you are particularly passionate about. I know this might be a little bit difficult for some depending on what the issue is at hand, and everyone feels strongly about different topics to differing degrees than others. So granted, this might be more difficult for some, but I would still say it's worth doing your absolute best to try and stick to this, because otherwise you're never going to find any sort of constructive points within the criticisms that other people are throwing your way, and you'll never be able to construct a fully encompassing argument, or at the very least a well thought out one. And the second part of this, actually, that I would like to get into regarding accepting criticisms and responding to criticisms is not just backing up your response with evidence, or not just immediately dismissing criticisms on the basis of that you might disagree with them, but the point that I would like to make after this is that it's also quite helpful to maybe look into why the person criticising you has those criticisms towards you, and has their own set of beliefs, and why they are presenting their criticisms towards you in this particular debate. Because ultimately their criticism comes from not just their differing point of view, but also perhaps the way they generally have an outlook on life and the world around them, and also even simply just the way they are conveying their point of view and their disagreement to your original point. Now, this can manifest in a few different ways. I would prefer it if, anyone who disagrees with me presented their disagreement to me in a mature, concise and calm manner. I would really not like it to be, say, the way that the Antifa sort of quasi-supporting left-wing protesters at UC Berkeley recently presented their disagreements to the free speech movement there and the supporters of Milo Yiannopoulos, where they essentially just made cordons and started chanting, and in some cases assaulted people. I would preferably hope that these people would have thought it would have been a better idea to instead ask to have a place in the talks where Milo Yiannopoulos and his fellow Conservatives were speaking, and try to debate it out with them and talk maturely, calmly, and in a, civilised way. Instead, unfortunately, the way they presented their argument was through quite uncivilised means. I'm going to be brutally honest. I mean, granted, this was not the case with everyone on that side of the debate in that particular situation. And I will say this before, you can't condemn the whole one side of a political spectrum just based on the actions of some, because not everyone's the same in every single group in society. But it does raise a somewhat unfortunate point where a debate and an argument that was worth having and was probably going to produce some very interesting points was unfortunately derailed by the fact that the people who were presenting their disagreements to the original point being made, that being the strivance towards free speech and the admission of the views of conservative students at UC Berkeley on behalf of people like Milo Yiannopoulos, who really, at the end of the day, mainly wanted to enhance the free speech capabilities of students of all political spectrums and affiliations at the university, when that was kind of derailed by the misrepresentations and angry actions of some on the left-hand side of the debate, who saw this admission of allowing freedom of speech to all students of all political spectrums and affiliations, including those who are conservative, as being a quite unreasonable acceptance of fascism and white supremacy. Now, this is a massive overgeneralization from the people who are protesting against Milo and his fellow Conservatives and other differently politically affiliated free speech advocates. And it unfortunately derailed the debate quite a lot. Primarily, I would say, on the account of how these people on the left-wing side, who many of whom supported Antifa, presented their argument, in that they really just didn't do it in a very constructive way. Now, I believe the way that the pro-Milo Yiannopoulos lot presented their response was fairly reasonable. They stated that they were there primarily to argue their point about encompassing free speech for not just people on the left, but people on the right and in the centre, of course, and allowing everyone of all political spectrums to have free speech at UC Berkeley and other places where they would be talking. And they simply just stated what they were there for, and then had a little bit of a joke at sort of the more extreme fringes of the anti sort of right and pro-Antifa protesters, and then unfortunately had to leave. And the main event at this speech was cancelled, unfortunately, as a result of the criticisms towards the people who were there standing up for the rights of the conservative students at UC Berkeley and the general theme of free speech. And it's quite unfortunate because many of the chants chanted by the pro-Antifa lot at this situation were, in their eyes, arguing for free speech, and what their actions showed was not pro-free speech. So, on one hand, you've got to be very, very, very careful about how you accept criticisms and not just immediately dismiss them, and sort of really think about for a moment about how you should respond to them, what evidence you should use to support your response, and whether or not the criticisms towards you are being logical or illogical. But then on the other hand, you've also got to properly analyse whether or not the criticism towards you are being either constructive or unconstructive. An example of a constructive criticism, I would say, would be someone messaging me over the internet and saying that I don't believe in the same views you believe. Here's why, here's some evidence, and here's why I believe my evidence supports my criticism of your particular view on this issue, Titan Ted. Now, if they presented that in a fair enough way, I would feel more than happy with chatting with them and having this issue hashed out and having our disagreement hashed out, so we can at least reach a circumstance of agreeing to disagree. And then a bad case, or a bad example of criticism, would be what the pro-Antifa people and far-left activists did at UC Berkeley, where they essentially inhibited the free speech of people who, by all rights and practicalities, were protesting and were speaking for free speech, and turned what was going to be a civilised and well-conducted speech and talk into a counter-protest that was built upon their own free speech being inhibited, which is really unfortunate and ultimately made the debate just kind of moot. I mean, I'm glad that Milo was still able to speak to a small handful of people who were at least sympathetic or supporting of him, and that's, I think, a good thing, that he was at least given some space to get his point across. A pity that he couldn't do it in the way that had been previously planned, as it was already previously organised and then, like I said, derailed by the pro-Antifa crowd. But unfortunately, that does mean that their way of protesting against these pro-free speech and, in some cases, conservative supporting lot did harm the conversation quite a bit. So not only do we have to, in my eyes, support our criticisms and our arguments with clear-cut evidence that is well-founded and well-sourced, but we also have to respond to criticisms in a concise, constructive and mature manner, while also sending out our criticisms in a concise, constructive manner. Because if we don't, well, as I've just explained, there's really not going to be much construction towards a concise, constructive or helpful conversation or debate of any kind. And really, that's the biggest loss of all, I think. And the more we don't do that, the more, well, I mean, just look at what happened at UC Berkeley. That kind of just shows the whole picture, really, of the dangers of not really substantiating criticisms by responding to them or making them in a fair enough way. Now, I'm going to be making one more episode in this series in debating etiquette, and it will be on the issue of what I see as being horseshoe theory. Now, this is probably a bit more contentious than this video or the one just before this video, but it's an issue I strongly believe in and that I think is very much worth talking about. In any case, I hope you people have enjoyed this video, or at least have found it helpful to some degree. If you do like this video, leave a like, comment, share and subscribe if you fancy doing that. If you like showing any extra support to me, be sure to check out my social medias and my other YouTube channels in the video description below. And as always, I've been Titan Ted, I've been your most gracious host, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care, and bye-bye.